Hello everyone! This video will highlight some of the main ideas from Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about language. Language is symbolic. Words and signs are arbitrary. The good thing about that is that language can allow us to do more communication than we could otherwise. But at the same time, remember what I said earlier this term about too much communication not necessarily being a good thing. In terms of being arbitrary, let's look at this little cartoon here of the Egyptians talking about hieroglyphics, basically. She's kind of stopping him and saying, what part of oil lamp next to double squiggle over ox don't you understand? Okay, so just in other words, just because, and you know, hieroglyphics are partially, the pictures actually do partially have real world representation, right? Unlike our letters in the alphabet really don't, and they're even more arbitrary. But yeah, so what would that mean if you were to look at that? We can maybe deduce any number of meanings from what's happening here. It's like this Egyptian man is coming after this Egyptian woman, or he's coming onto her or something for her to be pushing him away like that. But anyway, so yeah, language is, in terms of it being arbitrary, it only has meaning if a culture agrees to what that meaning is. And I have some examples here. So here I'm going to provide you with an example of how language is symbolic and arbitrary. All right, when you see this image that I have just switched to here on the screen, what comes to mind? What is this? Many of you may have said cat, or perhaps you said or thought gato, chat, or mao, depending on your native language. The point is, each of those words is entirely arbitrary. The individual languages, what caused each of them to identify those particular combination of letters to mean a cat? In other words, we have to agree on the meaning. So now let me ask you this. Did any of you think of anything else besides cat or cat in your native language when I displayed this image? It's possible some of you had other reactions. Perhaps you don't like cats. Perhaps you are allergic to cats, in which case whatever feelings or thoughts came to mind were probably negative. The image of a cat can be symbolic. In Western culture, tends to mean bad luck, but that is cultural. In Asian cultures, it means good luck. So, and considering we just passed Halloween, that might be something you thought of. If you love cats, have a cat, it might make you think of a cute, cuddly companion. There are 3 dimensions of language, and I'm going to take you through each of the 3 now. So the first dimension of language that I will talk to you about is semantic. Semantic refers to the meaning of language. So let's come back to our cat example again. I just showed you a moment ago how there can be multiple meanings for the symbol of a cat or the image of a cat. The literal meaning was the words in the various language that mean cat. We call that denotative when it's literal. The implied meanings, those that you may have thought of as I asked you for additional meanings, were the connotative or implied messages or implied meanings. And that's where we got things like allergies, bad luck, Halloween, and so on. So in that example, a mere image caused a number of thoughts, words, and implications in each of us, right? So you can see how already we're not even looking at strict words yet. Just an image can have multiple meanings. So when you combine that with the fact that language at least in English, is represented by letters, and in most languages it's represented by some kind of characters. That can add to confusion. So your book has something called an abstraction ladder, and as you go up the ladder, things get more abstract. So our goal is to actually be down at the bottom to remain grounded. And there we are as more specific in our statements to others to minimize misunderstandings. I have two clips here from Office Space to do with this character's flair, the buttons that she's wearing on her clothes for the restaurant that she works at as part of her uniform. There are two scenes to watch, and I've got them linked here. If you have the PDF open, you can just click those. If not, these URLs are provided at the bottom or in the description of the YouTube video. So if you could pause this one, jump out, watch those, and then come back. Don't forget to come back here after you do that. Okay, the next dimension of language that we'll talk about is syntactic. Syntax, when it comes to language, is the technical rules governing our grammar in whatever language we are speaking. It's important to note that even within a single language, a single culture, whole cultures within it may use different syntactic rules. Those who study linguistics know that language does change over time. So rules that may have been in place at one point for grammar can eventually evolve and change depending on how dominant a co-culture's practices become. Here I'll provide you with an example of how syntax in language can create misunderstandings. Your book has something called the Dear John letters on page 159. So if you want to flip to that now, go ahead and grab your book. So here is version 1 of the Dear John letter. And I'm going to read this according to where they've placed emphasis and punctuation. So I will modify my intonation accordingly. All right. Dear John, I want a man who knows what love is all about. You are generous, kind, thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me for other men. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we're apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Mary? Okay, so just sit with that for a second. Think about the meaning of that letter as it was written. Okay, so here is the same letter, same words. Punctuation is in slightly different places. As is beginnings and endings of sentences, so it actually changes the meaning. All right, so here we go. Dear John, I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men, I yearn. For you, I have no feelings whatsoever. When we're apart, I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Mary? So you can see the difference is striking, right? And you can also see then that our written language can create misunderstandings if we're not careful. This is one of the reasons why if you need to address something important, say with your boss or your boyfriend or girlfriend or your parents, it's best to do it in person where they can hear the intonation like you heard me doing there, right? Sometimes we phrase things in a way in text, particularly if you're doing this on phone text where it has to be really super short, right? All sorts of misunderstandings can happen. Okay, so the last dimension of language that I will talk to you about is the pragmatic dimension. The pragmatic dimension of language depends on context. We use language differently with our friends than with our parents, than with our colleagues, than with our boss at work, or in different places, like at a church, at a bar, etc., right? This should remind you of the definition of communication competency from chapter 1, right? Because we need to communicate both effectively and appropriately. So that has to do with context. One of the best things that you can do to minimize misunderstandings with other people is to take responsibility for the things you say and the things you do and the things you feel. This will reduce defensiveness in others and actually improve understanding. So next I'm going to provide you with a few techniques that you can use to take responsibility when you are speaking with others and therefore reduce defensiveness in the other person. The first thing is you should avoid you language. You language expresses a judgment of or blames the other person for something. A lot of times it's how you feel. So an example of you language, say you come in from work and you see a mess and you're upset about that. So you say, "You left this place a mess." Well, how do you think your roommate or significant other is going to respond if you say it that way? So here is the alternative to that statement that I just gave you about this place being a mess. Instead, use I language. So that's the next technique for taking responsibility and reducing defensiveness in other people. I language clearly identifies yourself as the source of any message. So you could instead say, "I don't want to be responsible for all of the cleaning in the apartment." And there you indicate why, essentially, that you want to remark that it's a mess, right? And that is the gist of it. That's the core of it, right? You come in and you think, "I'm going to have to do all this," right? That may help the other person understand where you're coming from. So here's another technique to help you take responsibility and reduce defensiveness in others. Avoid it statements. These statements avoid responsibility, avoid you taking ownership for whatever you say or however you feel, attributing it instead to some unidentified source. So for example, you say, maybe you're coming to your teacher to let them know why you're not doing well. You say, "It's a boring class." Well, gosh, can you imagine how that teacher is going to respond? Not a good idea. Instead, you should say, "I'm bored in this class." And in all truth, other students, maybe not all other students are bored. But that would give the teacher a good indication, okay, this student wants to be challenged, or this student wants to be in a different class that does challenge them, and so forth, right? It doesn't sound as personal. Okay. It also lets that person know that you recognize that it's not universal and that it's how you feel. So here is a technique you can use that actually incorporates all of the 3 previous techniques I just covered with you. It's a model sentence that you can use when you need to confront somebody about something. And it will hopefully reduce defensiveness in the other person if you approach whatever it is this way. So you say, "I feel," and then whatever the emotion is you're feeling, when, and then you describe the other person's behavior. And this last part is very important, because, and then the consequences of the other person's behavior, right? This is similar to the perception checking statements that you learned in chapter 3. There are some slight differences here. But this can open the door to having a more adult discussion about a problem than simply charging in and making a blanket statement like "this place is a mess" or "this class is boring." So next we need to talk about cultural differences when it comes to communication, because this chapter is about language and no discussion of language can avoid that there may be cultural difference at play as well. So why should we care about this? Well, this being a communication class, we are not isolated in the world. It's important that we can communicate with people from other countries and cultures. But even within the US, we don't live in a bubble here either. There are many co-cultures or diverse communities within our larger culture. We can't paint every US citizen with the same brush. So it benefits us all if we can learn to communicate well with people from communities that are very different from our own. The values that people hold in a culture can be thought of as points along a continuum. Why? Because there is duplication and similarities in values among cultures. For example, while we have our differences, our culture in the US is similar in many ways to many other cultures. What you see here on the screen are some vocabulary words for us to learn, not the hola and bonjour and all of that, but what's above it. They are going to appear again on a couple of different extra credit activities that I have planned for you. So you actually learned about individualism and collectivism earlier in your textbook. I believe it was covered in both chapters 2 and 3. Individualism and collectivism refer to whether the needs of the individual are more highly valued in a culture or if the needs of the group outweigh the needs of a single person. If you are familiar with Star Trek, or if there are any Trekkies among you, or is it Trekkers? I forget. Spock there, as you see, is dying. He's contaminated by radiation, I believe, and he says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few because his friend there, Captain Kirk, is upset that his friend is dying because he kind of threw himself on the gauntlet, so to speak. Spock sacrificed himself to save the whole ship. So that is an example of a collectivistic or a collectivistic point of view, collectivistic value, or what we call collectivism. This information here I pulled from a different textbook from another class that I teach called Conflict Management. And this is what that book lists. It goes from number 1 to 53 in the world of the countries ranked most individualist to most collectivist. So remember that these are points on a continuum. It's not an either or polar black and white situation. And depending upon who is doing the research, the results of where countries and cultures fall on these continuums is not precise. Take a look at these two lists. We've got the most individualist on the left and the most collectivist on the right. Look at those first 4 of the top 5. Do you see any connection between them? I would say Great Britain colonizing might be part of it. I realize Canada is partly colonized by France as well. Okay, now take a look at the most collectivist cultures. Do you see something interesting on that side? Any things that tie all of those together? Those are largely Latin cultures, or those that were colonized by Spain. So here's the caveat. Even within a culture, we as individuals might have different values. For example, if the US is considered the world's most individualistic culture, but you individually might be a more collectivistic person, then how do you label yourself? High context and low context communication are also on a continuum here. This is how verbal we are in our communication with others. Communication can be nonverbal, and in some cultures where tradition is highly valued, certain things are assumed or expected suspected of people's behavior rather than explicitly articulated. The US is typically low context, meaning we speak a lot and spell things out. Our rules and customs are frequently written down, often as official laws, and if they aren't law, someone will tell us that we aren't following the norms of the society. But in a high context culture, by contrast, it is assumed that cultural members know how to behave in certain situations. Less is spoken, more is nonverbal, and the culture as a whole is much more traditional. By that I mean their customs are time-honored. So you can imagine that as a visitor in a high context culture, if you are more low context, the difference in expectations about one another's behavior can potentially cause problems in your communication. So here is an example of that. It's a personal example of mine. I kind of stepped in it when I was in England. So they are low context like we are in the US, but they are not as low context as we are. So most of the people I encountered in my first year there were very reserved around me, and I found it hard to figure out what they really thought. It turns out that many of the things I was doing that were counter to their cultural norms were coming across strong. Being overtly or overly friendly and a little too outwardly bubbly or happy and expressive for the standard British stiff upper lip. They must have thought that I was so annoying. I think I rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in a very big way. And this in turn caused problems and conflicts for me that entire first year because no one would tell me not to be the way I was being or why I was getting the reaction I was. I could just tell they did not like me and I didn't know why. So here is a graph I pulled off the web. I should have cited the source. I did this so long ago that I don't know where I found this now. Anyway, so here's a graph that someone put together as far as where they believe the different countries fall on the continuum between high context and low context communication. Okay, so take a look there. On the left-hand side is the lower context communication cultures, the Swiss being at the farthest left, German next, Scandinavian next, and then there's us, American, then you got Australian. They don't list. Okay, so I'm assuming that UK is going to fall to them in the other Northern European, probably, so right there in the middle, which again, remember my example about the low context, high context problem I encountered when I was there. So this might partially explain that. We're a little bit apart on this continuum here, but keep going down the line. You got South American, African, South European, and then you've got Arab and Asian cultures. Asian at the far right of the being higher context, so using more nonverbals, more customary traditions for the behavior and so on. So remember what I said a moment ago, that these actually can vary depending upon who's doing the research. Here is another version that I found. This one is slightly different when you look at where things are. And once again, you still have one of the Asian cultures over there on the far high context on the right, Chinese, yes. And you still got African and Arab are still relatively toward that end as well. Then on the other side, they consider Germany. I don't see Switzerland though, so who knows? But and then Scandinavian, and then American. So roughly similar progression. And then English, so that would be the British, where I was when I was having that problem. And then the French, Italian, Spanish. I think this one's interesting because in the previous chart, if I were to flip back to that, my recording will stop, so I'll just stay here. In the previous one, those southern European countries, France, Italy, Spain, well, there's Greece. Greece is about in the same spot. So some of those were actually further, I think, to the right side of this continuum, depending, I guess. France is maybe, I don't know, you're kind of in the middle there, France. So, but Italian, Spanish, I think they're considered more southern. They're more warmer. Yes. Anyway, so you can see that there are differences. People have different opinions, and a lot of this is coming from actual research that they've done. So here is a graphic that I pulled in from another textbook, which I find very interesting. This author has combined the values of individualism and low context together. Be aware they are not the same thing, but they do often occur together. Likewise, she's combined high context communication with what she's calling relational. That is essentially what I just called a moment ago collectivistic or collectivism. So it is true, you do tend to find these things together, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. So let's take a look at some of the differences though in this illustration. One of the things that immediately strikes me is the eye contact. You see the difference there. The one on the left has a more focused eye contact, and really it should be looking at the other person, because that is our kind of our value in the lower context cultures. We like to make eye contact, and we find it offensive if people don't look us in the eye, right? Okay, so by contrast, the more high context cultures consider it rude to maintain eye contact or to stare at the other person. It is considered aggressive. It's actually rather more respectful to humbly avert your gaze. Whereas, once again, in the low context cultures, we find it disrespectful if someone doesn't look at us. We find it even dishonest if another person is talking to us and they won't look us in the eye, right? So you can see, once again, if people from different kinds of cultures are trying to communicate, lots of things can happen. People can really misinterpret the signals from each other, right? Okay, so another thing I find interesting in this illustration is that the way you say things, look on the right side of the graphic, the way you say things in a high context culture matters more than, look on the left side now, the actual words that you say matter more in a low context culture. So in a low context culture like the United States, what you say is what you mean. Okay, the very last thing I want to point out is in a high context culture, rather, sorry, so look on the right side of the screen again, the history or the relationship between the two people is very important. It defines how you speak to certain people. So here's another example of misunderstandings or conflicts being created by these cultural differences in low context versus high context communication. There's a recent series that came out on Netflix just in the past month or two called Emily in Paris. I have a scene here, a little clip for you to watch. So once again, you'll need to pause, press pause, jump out, jump back. Only watch the first 20 seconds of this. It's a large compilation, and the series being so new, there aren't a lot of clips out there for me to find the scene that I wanted. But the very first scene that they put in their compilation, I think a fan put this together, perhaps. The very first thing is exactly what I want to show you. Now, granted, this is referring to a stereotype, and you know we always want to avoid stereotyping. But from what I've been told from people in other countries about Americans in general, and even myself, is that this stereotype generally holds true. The series, Emily in Paris, you should know, got quite a bit of criticism from French people who watched it, because apparently the series really stereotypes French people. So if you, although I will say that in my handful of experiences going to France, and particularly Paris, most of the stereotypes that they offer in this series aren't so incorrect, in my opinion. But then again, I've never lived there, so who am I? Anyway, if you like this kind of thing, if you like looking at the differences in culture, it might be a fun series for you, but to watch. But again, take it with a grain of salt, because it is kind of Hollywoodized. There's another clip I'd like you to watch. It's an actual French person's opinion of that scene, as well as she goes on later in her video to discuss the challenges that cultures have when they are higher context as opposed to maybe lower context, and foreigners having issues with that. So I'd like you to watch that too. She explains it from her point of view, being a French person who's also lived in New York City. So she's gone both ways. She's seen foreigners struggle, and then she struggled when she moved to New York. So I think that will be a better illustration than I could provide you. She goes on to talk about what aspects of context are so important and why. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and all of the topics that you're going to be reading about this week in your textbook. I find discussions of language and culture personally fascinating, and I hope that some of that enthusiasm will rub off. Okay, so if you have general questions, you know where to post them. Thank you for watching, and I will be in touch again with you soon.